All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. It's a little bit after 7, so we have roughly 100 people on Zoom, which is fabulous, and we're so thrilled that you came in person, which is awesome. It would be really odd doing this to an empty room, and it's so nice to see people in person as well. So when we get to Laura, I'm going to do an introduction and talk a little bit about French and Pickering and our sponsors, and then she'll do her presentation, and after that, in the question and answer part, we have this nice little Bluetooth thing, and I'll walk around to give the speaker to people when they ask questions so that you all can hear, but also so that your question will come out of the speaker and the people on Zoom can hear the question as well. So that's sort of that part of our housekeeping. My name's Bill Gladden. I'm the executive director for French and Pickering Creeks Conservation Trust. I want to point out here an honored person here in the front row, Penny Hunt, who raise your hand, Penny. And Penny is a dynamo. If you don't know Penny, you're missing out. And she has put this lecture series together for us when COVID started and has kept going gangbusters ever since. And thanks to her wonderful efforts, you have a wonderful speaker here tonight. And also a nice thanks to Shelby's technical skills, you have a library of lectures online at frenchandpickering.org that you can pull up at any time. And in fact, we were having a Zoom conference with a local township supervisor about open space preservation in our region the other day. And she mentioned how wonderful it is that even when she can't get away from her newborn kids, she'll put on something from the library and one of the lectures and walk around the house when she's doing chores, cleaning up, just dealing with life. And what a wonderful asset that is to have. So I want to make sure that you all are aware that that's there for you as well. We are thrilled to be sponsored tonight by Patriot Dealerships. If you went to a previous lecture, you heard that they sponsored that as well. They've been very, very generous. They sell Chevrolets, Buick, and GMCs in Bucks and Montgomery counties. And Melissa and Jason Owens are the owners, and they also moved into Charlestown Township recently, and they updated their easement and eliminated another development right. So they are community members, and they don't just greenwash themselves. They actually walk the walk and are doing a great job of restoring their property as well. So if you are ever in the area or ever need anything used, I'm sure they have things that aren't Chevys or Buicks or GMCs. So if you need a car, they're good folks living locally. It's wonderful if you have a chance to support them, and we certainly appreciate their support as well. Our lecture tonight is Laura Cruz, and she's a garden designer and horticulturalist based in the Philadelphia region. Inspired by nature, ecologically-minded horticulture is her passion and expertise. She holds a master's of landscape architecture from the University of Sheffield and has spent several years working in residential and public horticulture, as well as the nursery industry, including with Natural Lands Stoneleigh, a natural garden, Creek Nurseries, Longwood Gardens, and Winterthur Museum Garden and Library. So we are so thrilled and grateful for you sharing your expertise with us here tonight, Laura. Thank you. You can project. Do you want to hand anything out? Or is that afterwards?
Actually, if you would like to.
Sure, I'd love to.
Thank you so much, Bill. And just yell if you cannot hear me, because I cannot project very well. I'm not a very loud talker, so I'll do my best. I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight. Again, my name is Laura Cruz, and thank you for kind of giving my introduction, Bill. I won't have to go through the whole resume again. But I grew up in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, not too far from here. And now I live just around the corner in Elverson, working on a private property as a gardener and a landscape designer. I am so lucky to be able to design and also care for a wide variety of different garden areas, as well as natural spaces as well. So my hope tonight is I will share with you a whole bunch of inspiration and some good tips that you can take with you this spring as you look at your own garden spaces and either design them anew or redesign them, rethink them, whatever it is that you would like to do this spring. So of course, I am a landscape designer, so I do not want to downplay the importance of hiring a landscape designer if you feel that is important to you, but I do think that if you have the time and the interest, there is so much that you can do on your own, if you would like. So this presentation is really meant to introduce you to the real basics of the landscape design process and give you lots of ideas as you tackle your own garden, as I said. But it won't really focus on, hardscape elements or color theory, any sort of specific design styles, because as I'll talk about more, designing ecologically can fit with really any kind of hardscape, any design style. So what we'll start with, I'll go over some planting design basics, and I'll also share with you tips for installation and maintenance, which in my experience, maintaining a lot of gardens, it is just as important as the design initially. And then we'll end with some pretty plant photos, some plant combos for a whole bunch of different types of site conditions. So what is garden design with ecology in mind? You may have heard many other terms, such as ecological horticulture or ecological landscape design, sustainable landscaping, rewilding, wildlife gardening. All of these are very similar, and we don't really have a cohesive, overarching movement. There are lots of different names for something that people are pretty much talking about the same thing. The Ecological Landscape Alliance, though, has a really great definition. They say that this type of gardening and designing is really meant to enhance the surrounding environment for the benefit of humans, but also all other life in the ecosystem. So the aim is to benefit us, but also all other living things, whether that's the birds, the insects, mammals, or even the microscopic life that we don't see in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi. This definition, I won't read the whole thing, but what I want to point out is ecological design also incorporates natural systems and processes. So in contrast to traditional horticulture, where, traditionally conventional horticulture and agriculture is very intensive in terms of altering the soil with fertilizer, water, and historically has been mainly about aesthetics or other human needs over really everything else. It's often been kind of a one-size-fits-all approach and all about controlling nature in a lot of ways. So ecological design, or designing with ecology in mind, in contrast, really focuses on understanding nature and natural processes and working with them instead of against them. And the result is that you really minimize a lot of resource inputs like water, fertilizer, soil amendments, pesticides, all of the use of all these really precious natural resources. So ultimately, ecological garden design is being mindful that we are part of the ecosystem. John Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So the work that land conservation organizations like French and Pickering does is so important in preserving natural areas. And how that land is cared for is really the next step. So how we care for our land, whether it's a giant woodland or a tiny garden, it has big impacts. Whether we live in a city or whether we live on the edge of a river or a forest, we're part of that ecosystem. And the plants we select, the gardening tasks we choose to undertake or not to undertake, these can really have a positive impact on all of the other living things that we share the land with. So I'd like everyone who's here and everyone at home on Zoom, if you would like to close your eyes for just a minute. And okay, good job. Imagine yourself in your dream garden. So look around you while your eyes are still closed. And what do you see in this garden that you would love for yourself? Look up at the sky. Are you looking up through flowering trees in the spring, or are you looking up through a vine-covered pergola? Look down at the ground. Are your feet nearby a patch of strawberries or on the cool kind of blue stone flags and next to some ornamental grasses? What do you hear? Do you hear the wind or birds? The sound of water? What do you smell? Do you smell roses or the spicy scent of a magnolia that's just been pruned? So you can open your eyes now. What you did right there was visualize a space where there wasn't one yet. So that's like the first step of the landscape design process. You can all say you're designers though. But the first thing really that a landscape designer does is they take a step back and they look at the big picture. So here are a whole bunch of questions and they're also on your handout. So you don't have to kind of read all of them here if you don't want to, that you can take home with you, and they really give you something to think about if you're deciding to redesign your whole garden, or even just thinking about a new bed or a container. I recognize that there's a lot here, but we'll go through a couple of them. So a couple questions to think through. What landscapes inspire you? Are there other gardens, public or private, that you particularly like? And what is it about these spaces that you really enjoy? How do you want to feel in your garden? Do you want to feel calm and relaxed, sheltered, safe? Do you want to feel energized? Do you want it to be a place where you can have parties? And what really practical functions do you want that garden to have? For example, I'm sure all of us want to create wildlife habitat, but do you want to grow food? Would you like to frame a beautiful view you have or screen a view? Is it really windy and you want to reduce that wind or provide shade? Do you want to have fragrant plants? Do you have stormwater issues? Do you have soil erosion? And then getting into the details a little bit more, are there particular plants that you really want to include or those that you don't like at all? Are there colors you like or dislike? What time of year will you be spending the most of your time in the garden, and what time of day? And then how much, this is so critical, is how much time can you spend on maintaining or caring for your garden? Like really honestly, you have to tell yourself, how much time am I going to commit? I think we all dream up these wonderful ideas and think, oh yeah, I'll spend all my weekends doing, working in the garden, when it often doesn't happen. And would you be willing to employ a garden maintenance service if you weren't going to be able to be out there all the time? And finally, the most practical of all the considerations is, what is your budget? So, the first step is thinking about what you want. The second step is thinking about, what does your garden want? What does your garden want to be? So each site's really unique and has its own assets and challenges. I'm sure all of you probably can think about the own spaces where you live and some challenges that you face and some things you like about it too. But again, working with instead of against those processes at play will make building your new space a much smoother process. So gain an understanding of the landscape you've got. And no matter what garden conditions you have, there will be plants that will work for that space. Matching the right plant to the right place will make your life so much easier. And just this photo right here, it was a picture of a sunny, south-facing, windy, dry slope. So I really looked to native prairie ecosystems and just plants that love like dry, blazing sun to put here. So I have things like Schizoparium, Scoparium, little blue stem. I have Eastern bee balm. I have Anise hyssop, just sun-loving, drought-tolerant plants. So getting to know your garden, again, I know this is a lot of words right here. It's also on your handout. But the site analysis, this is super critical and a great way to kind of get to know your garden and the nitty-gritty of it. So doing a soil test, I highly recommend it. Their University of Delaware has a great soil test, and Penn State Extension does too. It can tell you a lot of information about your soil, but one thing to know is and you can go to their websites and they can give you instructions on how to do that process. But you'll get this great report back. And interestingly, it will probably tell you to add some sort of amendment or some sort of fertilizer. And my advice to you is to not do that at all. Instead of actually amending your soil, you want to learn as much about that soil as possible, the pH, the organic matter content, all of the information it gives you, if it's low in some sort of nutrient, if it's really high. And then look at natural ecosystems and the plant communities in them to match plants to those conditions as much as you can. This is going to be so much easier in the long run and so much more sustainable than trying to add, some sort of acid type, amendment to your soil to make it more neutral, for example. So soil test is the first part. Then you kind of want to look at the history of the site. So did you just buy a new construction home that most likely has the topsoil stripped off and might have really compacted soil? Or do you live in an old farmhouse where, it might have this really, really rich fertilized soil that's been gardened for decades? What's the topography like? So do you have a really flat site, or do you have lots of steep slopes around? What direction does the site face? And are there existing plants that are really thriving on site? And these can be great clues to tell you what your soil is like. How much and what kind of sun does the space receive? Again, is your site windy or sheltered? And what other challenges are you facing on site? For example, do you have invasive pressure from really invasive weeds? Do you have road salt or other pollutants? Animal herbivory like deer, which I'm sure many of us deal with. And an add-on to this, there's nothing wrong with making a list of all these observations in a Word document or a notebook. But if you're feeling like you can and you like to draw, I highly recommend doing this visually by printing out. It's really easy. If you have an existing survey map of your property, going to Google Maps, or actually Chester County, if you live in Chester County, has a really great Chesco Views kind of application where you can get wonderful, even historic documents or aerial images of your property. You can print that out, and all of these observations, these questions you answer, you can note them on this map. And you can see kind of on this lower left-hand corner, just lots and lots of notes. And you can put existing trees, existing shrubs, where your shed is, all of these things. Oh, this is the area where it always floods every time it rains. And take photos as well. And then the fun part. Make a wish list. So many designers, architects, landscape architects call this something different. Often they call it a design program. I like to call it a wish list just because that's a much more fun and optimistic word. So take what you've learned about what your wants and needs are, and then what your garden's wants and needs are, and you can make this list of everything you want to include. And this will really be your filter or your guide as you go through the plant selection process and the rest of your garden building. And I have an example here that includes, I want this imaginary garden to be low maintenance. I have a budget of $500 for absolutely everything. I really want like spring and summer blooms, especially. And I don't like forsythia, which I'm sorry, I know it's blooming right now, but I don't want it in my garden. And I need plants that thrive in dry, part to full sun, pretty poor soil. I need deer-resistant plants. I have soil erosion next to this one part of the driveway, and I really want to create wildlife habitat. So once you have that wish list, you keep that with you. You can refer to that as you choose plants, as you go through the process of learning about different things to put in your garden, different native plants. And luckily, we are in a world where we have access to the internet. We have supercomputers in our pockets most of the time. There's a lot of information out there about plants and native plants especially. So scour the internet, read books, visit local nurseries, and make a list of the plants you'd like to include. Definitely research the eventual size of trees and shrubs and perennials and the plants you're looking at, and locate and space them apart accordingly. And again, I really like to find photos of the plants I like to use and make collages to see how they'll look in different seasons. And you can see here, this is an example of a plant palette in late summer, fall. It really gives you a good idea of how things will look throughout the entire season. If you really want to get crazy, you can make an Excel spreadsheet and you can list all of the plants. I'm a list person, so you list the plants, you can list them by trees, shrubs, perennials, and you can kind of even put the heights in there. You can put the eventual size, you can put wildlife value if you want to kind of highlight plants that have berries or blooms at different times of year. As you can see in this Excel spreadsheet example, I've listed each month of the year and then what color, what is blooming and what color it is, so you can see what bloom combinations there will be. And don't forget foliage too, in terms of aesthetics. And then you don't have to be an artist to design. I am a big advocate of designing on site, designing outside. If you want to draw a plan, that's great. But if you have access to your garden, it's right out the door, just go outside. These are a couple of tools I like to use. I love marking paint, temporary marking paint, and flags. Go out and also you can use hoses as well for the edges of beds to imagine. Spray out your potential garden beds, or you can use marking or flags if you want something a little easier to move around. Mark out potential plant locations, or you can use whatever you have on hand. If you have a whole bunch of old containers from other plants, you can use those. And then record, what you decide in a notebook or a fresh copy of your survey map. It's really good to do this and then step back and really imagine, say you have a flag for an oak tree. Step back and think about, what will that look like in 2 years? What will it look like in 5 years or 10 years? It's really fun to design on site like this. Once you feel good about things, you're ready to dig in to prepare the beds, purchase, and plant. So now those are really the basics of the design process. I hope that wasn't completely overwhelming, but here are a couple tips for keeping wildlife and the environment at the forefront as you design. So first and foremost, use native plants. We are so lucky to be in Eastern North America, where we have this incredible diversity of both beautiful and really beneficial native plants. Why native plants? These trees, shrubs, perennials, vines, they have co-evolved to benefit, or they've co-evolved with wildlife all around, birds, pollinators, and other insects who really depend on them for food, for habitat. Just don't plant invasive species. And I would stay away too, especially if you have a small garden space, from overly aggressive plants, even something like Canadian goldenrod. And, I mentioned insects, just a note about insects. I'm sure all of you love insects here, right? There's no one who doesn't like mosquitoes or doesn't like ticks. Why support insects though? So just a note about why they are so important. So according to the USDA, actually less than 1% of insects are considered pests. And insects are really critical for the functioning of our ecosystems upon which we depend. So insects are pollinators. They pollinate our food crops. They pollinate the plants that we depend on for oxygen. They recycle nutrients. Many of them actually prey on other harmful pests. And they really are the basis of our ecosystem. So without them, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, they would not survive. And that impact really works its way up. So this isn't a presentation about insects, but I just want to stress that they are not bad. So another design tip, plant densely. So if you think about the last time that hopefully you were able to walk in the woods, if you looked around you and it wasn't a really a deer heavy area, there were probably plants covering the ground. So in nature abhors a vacuum, essentially. The soil is almost always hidden. And plants really work together to fill spatial niches. And we can replicate this in our gardens. So you can consider planting potentially on all planes and surfaces, really mimicking that dense and layered quality of nature. You can see here, instead of just bare mulch, we have a sedge layer, which is a wonderful, wonderful kind of green mulch or ground cover. This also really reduces weed pressure by covering all that bare ground. You don't have any space for unwanted plants. And diversify and multiply. So plant many types of plants and plant as many plants as you can. Deciduous and evergreen trees, shrubs, perennials, sedges, grasses, vines, ferns. Include an array of flower types and bloom times and plant structures. The more diversity you have, the more food and cover options you provide to a wide range of wildlife throughout the entire season. And this is a photo taken from North Carolina Arboretum in Asheville, North Carolina. It doesn't have to be a super complex garden, but if you have space to plant one vine, why not plant 2 species of vines? Aesthetically, that's gorgeous, and you're also providing more blooms at different times and more diversity. Some installation advice. You want to plant for success, right? So wait for rain. So plant, it's coming up now, April, May. This is a great time to plant, as is fall. This is cool seasons when we naturally have more rainfall typically. It's much less stressful to plants to plant during this time. And it will require a lot less watering, a lot less kind of pampering if you plant during these times of year. Spring has always, I think, because it's so optimistic, spring has always been like the big gardening and planting time for many of us, but fall is often overlooked. And I actually prefer planting in fall in many cases because you plant during a really kind of not stressful time for these plants. Many of them, they're going dormant for the winter. So they have cool weather, they go to sleep, they wake up in a cool, nice spring season, and then they have the hot, dry summer. Whereas if you plant in spring, you just have to be sure that you can water as they establish during that hot and potentially droughty time. Don't skimp on the site preparation. So learn from a professional here. Don't make these mistakes. I am an impatient person, and many a time I have thought, oh, I've gotten rid of all the weeds on this site. It's fine. I'm just going to plant. But really don't rush. Make sure you really have eradicated all of the plants that you do not want on site before you plant a new garden. And if you have very aggressive or invasive plants, it may take some time to really weed those out. It might take a season. It might take 2 seasons. So be patient. Going along with that, consider non-chemical methods for eradicating weeds and existing vegetation. Tilling and using herbicides have been very conventional, traditional methods for removing species or, existing vegetation, and they're very tempting. But most of us in a garden setting, we don't have a huge scale. We can use alternative methods, and some of these include, smothering existing vegetation with a tarp. Either black tarps traditionally have been used or clear. I've used clear tarps, which work very, very well as long as you are doing this through a couple different seasons and you're making sure you have that tarp on there during the hottest season, which is summer, so that you can really, really kill off these plants. You can use cardboard that's been wetted and covered with a heavy mulch, newspaper that's been wetted and covered with mulch, or you can rent a sod cutter if you want to get a good workout to remove that top layer of soil and sod. That actually is a really good method. Here on this hillside, this was a roadside meadow. We removed weeds or vines by hand, like the really invasive aggressive species. And then we used this plastic, this clear plastic, which was old greenhouse plastic I was able to recycle from a friend who had a nursery. And we left this on for an entire season. And you can see just completely beautiful bare soil ready for planting after this was removed. Minimize the use of heavy equipment. So I'm going to be honest, if you are a person caring for a very large property, having a tractor is a godsend. It's very helpful. It's very useful. But for many of us in our garden settings, we typically don't need to be using large, heavy equipment. Consider enlisting help from friends, or maybe your neighbor has some kids that need some summer work. If the impact of using heavy equipment, it can be really detrimental to soil structure. It can cause compaction, which is not just bad for soil health, but that leads to problems for the plants that you want to grow in that soil. So best practices, if you do need to use heavy equipment, really only work in the soil when it's dry. Wet clay soil is especially prone to compaction, and that's a lot of what we have around here. Avoid using large equipment within the drip line, at least of a tree, or as far away from trees as you can. And if you have existing trees in your lawn, consider planting beds underneath them. That's a great place to start. This really minimizes mowing close to their root systems. Go electric. If you do need to use power equipment, consider using battery-powered tools. These are wonderful. They are so much quieter, and the noise from our power equipment really can disrupt wildlife. Not to mention the emissions from many two-stroke engines, well, from all two-stroke engines, are a really major source of air pollutants, such as fine particulates and many cancer-causing chemicals. And, there's a lot of discussions and about, like, among professionals actually, about using more and more electric and battery powered equipment. The battery powered equipment is getting much, much better. I love using battery powered string trimmers and blowers and chainsaws. So highly recommend. And then a couple more pieces of advice. So limit irrigation once new plants are established. So of course, when you've planted something new, you need to water that planting immediately. And mulching at the time of planting really helps as well to keep that soil from ever drying out. But when you water infrequently and deeply. And then once they're established, really only water if you absolutely need to during major drought situations. Plant small. So smaller plants have spent a lot less time in the nursery. And I worked at a nursery. I love nurseries. I think they're incredible places where there's so much life, but they are intensive environments. If a plant is in a container, it needs fertilizer. It needs a lot of water. So the less time, a plant spends in a nursery, the younger it is when it leaves, the less plastic container waste there has been used, the less pesticides, water, fertilizer has been used. Another good thing, you also save money by buying smaller, and planting will be a lot easier. And the result will be healthier, less stressed plants. For example, if you're planting really, really large balled and burlap trees, they're going to go through a time period where they probably may not grow at all, even for a couple of years, versus planting smaller containerized or even whip-sized plants that can really bounce back very, very quickly. Source plants as locally as possible. So on your handout, you have this list. We have so many great local nurseries that, have really high quality plants and that even specialize in native plants. And there are some plant sales coming up as well. So keep an eye out for that. I know that Brandywine Conservancy is not doing their plant sale this year though. So they are still a great source for seeds. So maintenance, a couple tips. And maintenance is not a glamorous term. Maybe we can say stewardship or care. I love maintaining gardens. I love weeding. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but it's not too bad. And people always ask me, or request kind of a low or a no maintenance garden. And, that's really the dream, right? But the truth is that no garden is maintenance free. So best to just start enjoying that weeding. So in order to so again, I love to weed, but I like to work smart. So one way to do this is to really get to know your garden weeds. And you can expect after you plant, the most intensive time of weeding will be in the first 3 years, as your perennial layer, as your ground covers establish. And during that time, look around, you may have some of these weeds. These are the weeds that I'm dealing with right now. Lesser celandine, hairy bittercress, which is not as horrible as lesser celandine. It's not an invasive species, but it drives me crazy, that hairy bittercress. I see it flowering and I get really stressed out because I know it's a cool season annual. And when you see it flower, if it gets a little bit of rain, if it gets a little bit of sun, it's going to go to seed and spread those seeds all over the place. So the smart way you can deal with that is really target that weed before it goes to seed, and you can make your life so much easier in the future by preventing that seed source. So again, just get to know, where are these plants native to? Are they perennials? Do they come back every year? Are they annuals that will only live 1 year but really have often a very large seed dispersion? Biennials, which have a 2-year life cycle, or are they vines, shrubs, and trees that are going to have, and perennials have pretty extensive root systems that you're going to want to remove as well. And this is a big one, some insect damage and disease, it's normal and it is okay. More often than not, the minor damage that native insects do to our native plants especially is not going to be detrimental to overall plant health, because those plants have evolved together. That insect does not want that plant to die. It wants to continue nibbling on the leaves of that plant so it can thrive and the plant can thrive too. Just don't use pesticides. There's no need. Pesticides have harmful effects that go beyond the insects that they target. They can harm birds and other animals that prey on those insects. I would highly recommend attracting birds to your garden and, with habitat, with plants, and letting them keep insect populations in check. You can also select disease-resistant cultivars and, just use best practices like pruning out damaged and diseased parts of plants to prevent the spread of disease. And this is just an example of cedar hawthorn rust on a service berry. This is a native fungus. It kind of is dependent on both eastern red cedar and service berries or hawthorn family plants. And it's really not detrimental to the health of the plant. You get kind of this strange looking fungus on the berries, and you won't be able to eat them, but it will not be detrimental to the tree itself. Hold back on the cutbacks. So don't worry about fall cleanup. There's a lot of discussion now about leaving the leaves. Leave your perennials standing over the winter as well. Leave the leaves and stems in place. It really provides wonderful shelter and food for birds and for overwintering insects and other fauna during those really cold months. And I don't have it with me, but this past winter when we had a lot of snow in my backyard, I had some standing asters and Amsonia and a couple other things. And there were juncos. It was like windy right after a snowstorm. And they were just hopping around like under the asters, eating seeds. They also provide a lot of these perennials and trees provide protection from predators, like Cooper's hawks in my case, that were really keen on looking for those juncos. Reuse what you have. So there's no waste in nature. So there are many things that you can do with leaves, with pine needles, with sticks, perennial stems. The bottom two photos here are from Chanticleer, which is a lovely public garden in Wayne, where on the one hand, they have created a wildlife habitat pile with debris. And on the other side, they've used pine needles to create a really cool design in a garden bed. So there's just a multitude of things you can do with debris or waste from your garden. Mulch does not have to be hardwood and pristine. And finally, don't ever despair. Christopher Lloyd, who was a rock star gardener of Great Dixter, an amazing gardener and plantsman, said, "The great wonder in gardening is that so many plants live." And it's true. It's true. They are survivors. So if something is not going well in your garden, don't despair. Evaluate, become a detective and evaluate what thrives and what doesn't. If something isn't thriving, just consider why. Does it need to be moved? Is it not in the right condition for that plant? Did it go through a drought or another type of stressor? Or do you think it just needs to be a different plant? In this case, this is a sad arborvitae that is just in a place where the deer are going to eat it. So maybe there's a better plant for that spot. So how are we all feeling? Are we ready for some pretty plant photos now? Are you completely overwhelmed with, oh no, I need to do this and that? The one thing I'll say is all of this advice, I certainly don't want anyone to think I need to go home and do all of these things all at once and feel pressure to, you know, if you haven't been doing these practices, that you've been doing it all wrong. If you try just one of these things, something different, I think that's wonderful. You know, there's a different solution for kind of every garden area, and trying things a little bit at a time, trying something different is really, I think, the way to go. So I have 3 different kind of garden site conditions that I'll share some plants for. The first one is partial to full sun, kind of medium to moist, average to rich soil. So this, if you have this kind of garden situation, you might want to take inspiration from plant communities like wet meadows, floodplains. This photo here is of a meadow that's covered in blooming golden Alexander. And this is a variety of a couple trees, a couple shrubs, and some perennials. And again, there are so many more. I just chose a handful. I really wanted to highlight swamp white oak and red maple as trees that are excellent for kind of sunny, wet conditions, though, or even kind of medium moist soil conditions. Our oaks, our native oaks, are really keystone species. So if you can only plant one tree and you have the room, I would highly recommend planting an oak tree. And white oak family trees are less prone to some of the challenging diseases right now in the plant world. Swamp white oak is really adaptable. It supports also over 500 species of caterpillars, and caterpillars, more than any other insect, they are like the basis of the food source for our birds, for many other species. They're a really good source of protein. Red maples, you've probably seen them blooming today and in the past couple days. They're a great early season pollinator plant, and they support almost 300 caterpillar species. Our native viburnums, bottlebrush buckeyes, and sweet pepper bush are incredible pollinator plants. And that sweet pepper bush, also called Clethra alnifolia, just has incredible, wonderful fragrance in the summertime. Winterberry hollies, lovely berries for birds in the winter. And then some of my favorite perennials for this type of situation, swamp milkweed, New York ironweed, and there are many types of goldenrods. I'm featuring Solidago rugosa here though, because it's more of a wet loving species. All of these are wonderful pollinator plants and also support a number or hosts to a number of actually specialist bee species. And then plants for full sun and dry, poorer soil. So these would be, you could be looking to prairie ecosystems, to barrens, to coastal areas. A couple of my favorite woody species for this type of situation are eastern red cedar and prunus, any cherry, any native cherry really. In this case, it's called a plum, but prunus is really the cherry plum family. So eastern red cedars, they're definitely my favorite evergreen. They have super wildlife value. They love full sun. They're drought tolerant. They're really adaptable to different conditions. They're fairly deer resistant, and they produce these blueberries that are actually fleshy cones that birds, especially cedar waxwings, love in the wintertime. And a whole host of other animals love them as well. They're great shelter and cover for wildlife. And after oak trees, the Prunus genus supports, the next greatest number of caterpillars, with supporting about 340 caterpillar species. I featured beach plum because it has edible fruits for humans. And it also is valuable to a wide range of other wildlife. Fothergilla, super adaptable shrub. It can handle shade and full sun. I've seen it and it might have been like the Patriot, it might have been the Patriot Park, one of the Patriot parking lots or something. So it can handle just really dry, full sun conditions. And then there are also so many different perennials for these types of situations, from purple coneflower to anise hyssop, blue false indigo, aromatic aster, which is a very drought tolerant aster, also a deer resistant aster because it has fragrant foliage. Our mountain mints, in particular, narrow leafed mountain mint tends to like drier to medium soil. And then eastern bee balm is a really great drought tolerant Monarda species. It's in the mint family, so it's pretty tough, and it's a great pollinator plant. Important nectar source in the spring. And then finally, plants for shade. And this is dry to average soil, because I find that a lot of us have sort of shady places that in our gardens that are dry shade, which is like one of the toughest conditions I think people are dealing with. So in terms of trees, I highly recommend Eastern Redbud. And, great tough plant. It has a taproot, so it is relatively drought tolerant. Even though it can handle a little bit of moisture too, a little more moist soil. The only thing I'd say about planting one of these is to plant it small, because it does not transplant well because of that taproot. Sassafras, it is an incredible tree. It's a larval host for the spicebush swallowtail and several other butterfly or Lepidoptera species. I think it's really underused as like a specimen tree too. I have seen some gorgeous large sassafras trees, and it has incredible bark, beautiful fall color. So highly recommend that as a hedge as well. Nine bark is a common is a great kind of drought tolerant, shade tolerant shrub with white late spring, early summer blooms. And then a whole host of ground covers as well, from hay-scented fern, which is a pretty, probably one of the ferns that tolerate, well, also Christmas fern, tolerates drier shade. Eastern columbine, which This particular cultivar is called pink lanterns. Typically, the species Columbine is red. Sea oats, which is great if you have deer issues. It's an ornamental grass that tolerates shade and dry shade at that. Woodland stonecrop, whitewood aster, and crested iris. And because I couldn't list, tons and tons of native plants, here are some more recommendations for books that have great native plant lists, but also have more information about designing with ecology in mind. I actually brought the Living Landscape with me tonight if anyone wants to look at it. It's a great kind of introduction to ecological design and has a great list in the back of native plants and kind of their ecological benefits. Also, a couple websites I highly recommend when you're researching plants. Missouri Botanic Garden has an incredible plant finder tool. And when you can Google, a plant name, an MBOT or a Missouri Botanic, and it will tell you everything you need to know about this plant, from the height and the spread to where it's native to if it's deer resistant, if it has pests and diseases, just everything you could need as a gardener. And Mount Cuba Center, if you haven't been there, I highly recommend it, a visit. It's in northern Delaware, but they also have some incredible plant trials focused on perennials for the most part. But they research them for about 3-year periods, and then they publish trial reports that are completely free. They're all online, and it's really tells you which plants work well in our region in the Mid-Atlantic. They also have started to do more evaluations of wildlife, or particularly pollinator benefits as well. And finally, my recommendation is always just to keep on learning. So explore natural areas. If you live here in Chester County, we're so lucky to have incredible nature preserves and natural spaces to explore. Go outside and walk a trail, take pictures, draw, bring a field guide, see how nature has designed itself. I highly recommend that. And second best or just as good as visiting public gardens and see how people design. Talk to the staff there, ask questions, look at the signage, learn what plants are. And if you have the time and resources, take classes or volunteer, both at land conservation organizations or public gardens, because working alongside professionals is such a great way to learn and really support the good work that they're doing. And finally, if you feel completely overwhelmed, don't be afraid to consult with experts. There are more and more experts with ecological knowledge out there, design experts and horticulturists who are really passionate about what they do and really want to share that with people. So with that, thank you very much and happy gardening.
While I'm firing this up for the question and answer, I'm going to sneak in a question of my own. You mentioned that it's can be beneficial to plant plants at the base of trees. What would you recommend at the base of oak trees?
Oh, so many things. So, there are lots of really great ground covers. I call them kind of like if you have a tree well or a tree ring, if you don't want to kind of mow right up to the base of a tree and you just want a little circle, instead of mulching that every year, I highly recommend sedges. So, on the one hand, they don't have really showy flowers, but many of them kind of have a presence throughout the year, even in the winter time. And they're sedges for drier shade and wetter shade, depending on where that oak tree is. Another ground cover that I really liked and actually planted under some oak trees is we have a wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana. And it puts out these runners, it fills space really quickly.
Some big strawberries you can eat?
It does, yeah. They're tiny, but they're really, really good. So, but if you have deer, the deer might eat them too.
Might help themselves, yeah. Right there. Well, who else has some questions? Lots of questions. Awesome. Let's see if this worked. Oh, it didn't work. It worked in the office when we tried.
Shelby was right. She said, "Mine won't, it'll probably be packed up."
Bluetooth mode.
That's promising, doesn't it?
Thank you, Bluetooth, yes.
Okay.
Oh, I noticed you use clear plastic to kill grass. Why wouldn't you use black plastic? It gets hotter, it doesn't let the sun in. So is there some reason that you don't use black plastic?
So typically traditionally and typically I would use black plastic, but I read, I don't remember if it was, I think it was University of Maine. There's some research coming out of there and it's more focused on agricultural use of clear plastic to kill off weeds. But I was really, really intrigued by that and I wanted to try it to see if it would be effective. And I found it was because actually, as long as you have that during the warm season, like the summer when it's really, really going to heat up, the soil actually heats up more because you have that greenhouse effect of the sun going through the clear plastic. So it really heats up the top layer of the soil and is allegedly kills off some weed seeds as well. But I was really terrified because I put that plastic on. In the early spring, I came back in the late spring and all of these plants were like growing just like furiously underneath it. Like it was pushing up the plastic and I thought, oh no, this is a failure. And I came back a couple months later and everything had died. It was just, it heated up just enough to kill off all that vegetation. So, yeah.
It's on. Just put it up to your mouth.
So I have a question about, are those, those covers for beds? Well, we have some growing underneath, there. Does that do the similar thing?
Do you mean like landscape fabric, maybe?
It's,
We have a cold frame.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
That's what he's referring
yes.
Yeah.
to. We still get weeds.
Yeah, cold frames, I mean, really, they're a great way to extend the season. But then you have a longer season for those cool season weeds in some cases, like that hairy bittercress to grow. But if you had some plants, like a sedge, for example, if you planted a sedge there, that might kind of just completely die back in the winter. If you plant it in a cold frame, it might actually stay evergreen all winter because it's just slightly warmer and more protected.
I have some very large burning bushes that are 10 feet tall, like 3 of them clumped together. I'd like to take them out. What would you suggest replacing them with?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes, every burning bush can be replaced with something wonderful. Well, so what kind of soil situation do you have? Is it wet? Is it kind of dry? I mean, burning bush can kind of live
It's
everywhere.
very sunny and clay-like and dry. Like I have a path right next to it that I walk on all the time, and right now it's cracked because it's so dry.
Mhm. Well, burning bush has, the one thing about burning bush that people really like is that fall color. It's blazing red in the fall. Fothergilla actually, so it's very drought tolerant. It can handle full sun. It has really, really beautiful like orange to red to all sorts of different colors in the fall. So if you really want that great fall color, that's a really good one. Itea virginica or Virginia sweet spire. So that it's interesting because it's native to wetter soils, wetter environments, but it's very, very drought tolerant. And that has a really pretty purple red fall foliage as well. So those two I would recommend. Mhm. I think there was also a question on Zoom. Someone had said on the same question, asking about planting under trees. There are so many roots at the base of trees. How do you dig around those to plant anything? So that's a great question. We really, in established trees, planting small is the best thing you can do. So luckily, more and more you're seeing like in nurseries and garden centers, small plants, either quart containers, 4-inch pots, or even smaller. There are some online nurseries like I think Prairie Nursery that has plugs that are very, very narrow. They're maybe like 1 inch or 2 inches wide. So planting small when you're planting underneath the tree is definitely the way to go. So you don't have to dig too deep. And if you come upon a root, you're digging by hand, so you're hopefully not doing too much damage to that root, and you can just move to the side instead of damaging that root.
We'll go to someone elsewhere. We'll come back to you.
Do you have a favorite local place to buy natives?
Oh, there's so many. So I feel really lucky. My mom kind of introduced me to native plants in a sense because she used to take, well, we still every year will do the Delaware Nature Society and the Brandywine Conservancy plant sales. So those two sales are close to my heart. But I love Redbud Native Plant Nursery. They're in Media, and they're owned by two amazing women who are very, very knowledgeable. They're also designers, and they're growing really great high quality plants. But it's hard for me to kind of just single out one. I think we're lucky that we're in the Mid-Atlantic where there's such a history of horticulture. So we have a lot of really good nurseries.
Oh, I like the idea of wild strawberries. I remember as a kid picking them in the field, but they're not very aggressive. So how would they really make good ground cover? Because I don't think they're particularly aggressive. They're hard to, spread out, and grasses and everything else takes over usually.
So yeah, that's the importance of kind of eradicating grasses, because what's interesting about a lot of our native plants is they grow differently than, well, they're not adapted to growing with European kind of turf grasses. So a lot of them are outcompeted by European turf grasses, which, grow these really thick mats of roots. They grow rhizomatously, or they grow by their roots. So a lot of our native plants, even the ones that in a garden situation, like our wild strawberry, do spread prolifically. Like they do spread really well. When it comes to battling out turf grasses, a lot of them don't do so well. One of the natives that I do see battling, or at least holding its own among turf grass, is actually butterfly milkweed. I have seen in like old fields, in hay fields, the beautiful orange butterfly milkweed around here. And that actually can coexist with European turf grasses because it has a taproot. So its root system kind of works with those rhizomatous roots around it. Yeah.
Bamboo. How's the cheapest way to get rid of it?
The cheapest way. I think it's just a lot of hard work. It is possible to eradicate bamboo. The house that I moved into had a huge grove of bamboo when we moved in, and it took a lot of family coming over for many days, for a long time, using a chainsaw, using loppers, everything you can think of. We did drip glyphosate into some of the bamboo. We tried pretty much everything. And just then, so after that initial cutback, then every time it popped back up, cutting it immediately to kind of drown it of its resources, prevent it from photosynthesizing, that you can do it. It's just a lot of hard labor. And then, I blocked it out. There still are, in my garden, there are 3 patches maybe, where there's like a small, really manageable place where the bamboo does come back, and I pull it every year. But I think it took 3 seasons looking back on it. And I don't, advocate for using herbicides if you don't have to, but if you do decide to do that, like sparingly, using that in the fall as plants are kind of pulling all of their resources back into their root system will be the most effective timing to use that, so you don't have to use it very much. I think there was just a question about the handouts, if they'll be shared online.
That's a good idea. Yeah, we're happy to do that.
Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks.